"You're not family anymore, Eleanor. Dad is gone, and this house belongs to us now," my daughter-in-law said while clearing the dinner plates as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. My son didn't even look up from his wine glass when she said it. He just sighed softly and rubbed the bridge of his nose like a tired businessman trapped in an inconvenient meeting. I sat there frozen at the end of the oak dining table my late husband and I had bought 32 years ago from a small furniture shop outside Milwaukee. The candles from Harold's memorial dinner were still burning between us. Their soft light flickered across framed family photos lining the walls, photos that suddenly felt like evidence from someone else's life. 1 week earlier, I had stood beside my husband's grave holding a folded American flag while the November wind cut through my black wool coat. 40 years of marriage reduced to a wooden box of ashes sitting on the fireplace mantel. I thought losing Harold would be the hardest thing I would ever survive. I was wrong. "The upstairs master bedroom will be too much for you alone," Vanessa continued, stacking dishes with sharp little movements that sounded louder than they should have in the quiet room. "We already talked about converting it into a nursery." Nursery. The word hit me harder than I expected. Harold's side of the closet still smelled faintly like cedar and aftershave. His reading glasses were still sitting beside his favorite recliner in the den. I had not even gathered the strength to donate his winter coats yet, and already they were planning a nursery. "Mom," my son Daniel finally said without meeting my eyes. "Vanessa, and I think it's time for everyone to move forward." Move forward. People always say those words when what they really mean is move aside. I folded my hands carefully in my lap because I could feel them starting to shake. At 68 years old, dignity becomes a quiet survival instinct. You learn that humiliation looks worse when it's loud. Vanessa leaned against the kitchen counter and gave me a smile so polished it almost looked kind. "There's a lovely senior community about 20 minutes from here. They have yoga classes, card nights, transportation services." Her voice faded into the background as my eyes drifted toward the dining room window. Outside, snow had started falling over the backyard Harold loved so much. He used to spend entire Saturday mornings feeding birds while drinking coffee from his old green thermos. Every corner of this house carried pieces of him, pieces of us. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "We're just trying to be practical, Mom." Practical. Another cruel word disguised as wisdom. I slowly pushed my chair back from the table. The sound echoed through the dining room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maybe they expected tears. Maybe they expected pleading. But grief had already hollowed me out too deeply for that. I picked up my sweater from the back of the chair and held it tightly against my chest. "You should get some rest," Vanessa said softly, though there was relief hidden underneath her voice now. Relief that the difficult conversation was ending. I nodded once and walked upstairs without another word. Halfway up the staircase, I stopped beside the family portrait hanging on the wall. Harold stood behind me in that photo with his hands resting proudly on my shoulders while Daniel smiled beside us at 17 years old, still sweet, still mine. I stared at that picture longer than I should have. Then I looked toward the closed master bedroom door at the end of the hallway and realized something cold and terrifying. They thought I was powerless now, and that was going to become their biggest mistake. I closed the bedroom door behind me and stood there in silence, still holding my sweater against my chest like it could somehow keep the rest of me from falling apart. The room felt colder than usual that night. Harold's side of the bed remained untouched except for the slight indentation his body had left in the mattress over years of sleeping beside me. I slowly sat down on the edge of the bed and looked toward the window where snow continued drifting across the backyard in soft white waves. For the first time since Harold died, I allowed myself to admit something I had been avoiding all week. I was no longer grieving inside my own home. I was grieving inside someone else's plan. Downstairs, I could hear muffled voices and the faint clinking of dishes being loaded into the dishwasher. Vanessa's laugh floated upward through the vents, light and relaxed now that the difficult part of the evening was over for her. Daniel said something quietly, and she laughed again. It startled me how normal they already sounded. Harold had only been gone 8 days. 8 days. I reached for the framed photo on my nightstand, the one from our 40th anniversary trip to Door County. Harold stood beside me wearing his faded navy windbreaker, smiling into the sunlight with one arm around my waist. I remembered that morning clearly. We had walked nearly 2 miles along the shoreline because Harold insisted the best coffee shop in town was hidden near the marina. My knees had hurt halfway there, and he teased me the entire walk, promising me the cinnamon rolls would be worth it. They were. Small memories become dangerous after loss. They arrive quietly and leave devastation behind them. I opened the top drawer of my nightstand and found one of Harold's old handwritten notes folded beside my reading glasses. He used to leave them around the house for me to find. Grocery lists mixed with little messages. Thinking of you. Do not forget your appointment Thursday. Love you more than yesterday. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. The ink had faded a little over time. Eleanor, if anything ever happens to me, promise me you will not let anyone push you aside. This house is yours as much as mine. I stared at the note until the words blurred together. Harold had written it almost 6 years ago after Daniel first suggested we downsize into a retirement condo near Phoenix. Vanessa had supported the idea immediately back then too. She always smiled sweetly whenever the subject came up, but Harold never trusted how quickly she discussed other people's futures. I carefully folded the note again and slipped it into my sweater pocket. Downstairs, footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. Cabinet doors opened and closed. Life continuing beneath me while mine stood perfectly still. I walked slowly toward the closet and opened Harold's side. His winter coat still hung exactly where he left it. Brown wool, slightly worn at the cuffs. I pressed my face into the shoulder and breathed in the scent of cedar and aftershave that still lingered there. Then I noticed something strange. Several of Harold's important file boxes from the upper shelf were gone. I stepped back immediately, my heartbeat quickening. 3 gray storage boxes had always sat beside the spare blankets. Tax records, insurance documents, property papers. Harold was obsessive about organization. He labeled everything carefully with black marker. But now there was only empty space where the boxes used to be. For a long moment, I simply stood there staring at the shelf. Then I slowly closed the closet door and looked toward the bedroom hallway outside. Suddenly, Vanessa's cheerful voice downstairs sounded very different to me. Not relaxed, not relieved, confident. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of footsteps moving through the hallway outside my bedroom. For a brief second, my sleepy mind reached for the old comfort of routine. Harold checking the thermostat. Harold heading downstairs to start coffee. Harold humming softly to himself while reading the newspaper in the kitchen. Then reality settled over me again like cold fog. I remained still beneath the blankets, listening carefully. The footsteps paused outside my door before continuing toward the staircase. Too light to be Daniel. Vanessa. A few moments later, I heard drawers opening downstairs. Cabinet doors. Quiet movement. Not the careless sounds of someone living in a home. The careful sounds of someone searching through one. I slowly sat up and reached for my robe. The digital clock beside the bed read 5:42 a.m. Snow still covered the backyard outside, turning the early morning light pale blue through the windows. The house felt unfamiliar now, not because the furniture had changed or because Harold was gone, but because the air itself felt different, like I was being tolerated instead of loved. I walked quietly into the hallway and stopped at the top of the stairs. Vanessa stood in the living room wearing one of Daniel's old college sweatshirts, her blonde hair tied loosely back as she sorted through stacks of papers spread across the coffee table. Harold's papers. My chest tightened instantly. She glanced up when she noticed me standing there, but her expression shifted so quickly into polite surprise that for a second I almost questioned what I had seen. "Oh," she said brightly, placing one hand against her chest. "You startled me." Her smile appeared smooth and effortless, but her fingers immediately slid one folder partially underneath another. "I could not sleep," she continued. "I thought maybe organizing some of Harold's financial paperwork would help Daniel later." I slowly descended the staircase, one hand resting against the railing. Those files were in my bedroom closet. Vanessa gave a small shrug, as if the detail meant nothing. "Daniel brought some of them down after you went upstairs." That was a lie. I knew it instantly. Daniel had stayed downstairs the entire evening after dinner. I reached the final step and looked more carefully at the documents scattered across the table. Insurance forms, mortgage statements, bank correspondence, and one large manila envelope with property deed printed across the front in Harold's handwriting. Vanessa noticed my eyes settle there and casually placed her coffee mug on top of it. "You should really rest, Eleanor," she said gently. "Stress is not good for your blood pressure." The comment landed softly, but something underneath it felt deliberate, measured, like she was already preparing arguments for conversations that had not happened yet. I moved toward the kitchen without responding. The coffee pot had already been started, but the smell made my stomach uneasy this morning. Through the kitchen window, I could see Daniel outside, near the garage, speaking quietly on his phone. He turned slightly away when he noticed me watching. Another small thing. Another quiet movement that suddenly mattered. Harold used to say that lies rarely arrived loudly. They arrived in patterns. Forgotten details. Changed routines. Closed doors. I opened the refrigerator and stared blankly inside without really seeing anything. My reflection stared back faintly in the stainless steel surface of the freezer door. Older than I remembered. Tired, but no longer confused. Behind me, Vanessa gathered the papers back into neat little stacks. Daniel and I were also thinking, she said carefully. It might help if we put the house in both our names temporarily while everything gets sorted legally. Just to avoid complications. I slowly closed the refrigerator door and turned toward her. She smiled again. Calm, patient, confident that grief had made me weak. But standing there in that quiet kitchen with snow covering the backyard Harold loved, I finally understood something important. They had already started making plans for a future that did not include me. That afternoon, I drove to the small bank branch Harold and I had used for nearly 20 years. The roads were still lined with dirty snow from last week's storm, and gray clouds hung low over the city like damp wool blankets. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual as I waited at a red light downtown. My thoughts kept replaying the image of Vanessa standing over Harold's paperwork with that calm little smile on her face. By the time I pulled into the parking lot beside the bank, I already knew I was not there because of suspicion anymore. I was there because something inside me had finally accepted the truth. Harold had always handled most of our financial records himself, but he never kept secrets from me. Every month, we sat together at the kitchen table reviewing statements and expenses while he drank black coffee from his chipped green mug. He used to joke that marriage survived on two things: honest conversations and separate blankets during winter. The memory almost made me smile as I stepped carefully across the icy sidewalk toward the entrance. Inside, the warmth smelled faintly like printer paper and old carpet. Christmas decorations still hung near the teller windows even though January had already arrived. A young teller greeted me politely, but I asked if Mr. Benson was available instead. Frank Benson had been Harold's banker for years. He attended our anniversary party once. Sent flowers after Harold passed away. 10 minutes later, I sat across from him in his office while snow drifted slowly beyond the glass windows behind his desk. Frank looked uncomfortable almost immediately after I explained why I had come. Eleanor, he said gently, folding his hands together. I assumed Daniel already discussed everything with you. My stomach tightened. Discussed what? Frank hesitated for just a second too long. Then he opened a folder sitting beside his keyboard. About the transfer requests Harold submitted before his surgery in October. I stared at him blankly. Harold had minor heart surgery in October. Routine, the doctors called it. We never imagined his heart attack 2 months later would take him entirely. What transfer requests? I asked quietly. Frank adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents. Your husband began the process of moving several joint assets into a family trust. The room suddenly felt very still around me. A trust controlled by whom? Frank's expression shifted slightly then. Confusion. By you and Daniel jointly. At least that was the original structure. Original. Another word that landed wrong. Original. I repeated. Frank slowly turned the folder toward me. About 3 weeks later, we received updated paperwork requesting amendments. My eyes scanned the page slowly until I saw the signatures near the bottom. Harold's name, Daniel's name, and beneath them, witness authorization signed by Vanessa Carter. I felt cold all over despite the heat inside the office. Harold never mentioned changing anything. I whispered. Frank leaned back carefully. To be honest, Eleanor, I found the timing unusual myself. Harold seemed uncertain during the second meeting. Distracted. I could barely hear him now. My pulse throbbed loudly in my ears as pieces started connecting inside my mind. The missing file boxes. Vanessa sorting documents before sunrise. Daniel avoiding my eyes. The sudden pressure to move me out. What exactly changed? I finally asked. Frank's voice softened further. The revised trust would transfer majority control of the property and financial accounts to Daniel immediately upon Harold's passing. Majority control. Not shared equally. Not protected. Jointly. Controlled. I looked down at Harold's signature again. Something about it seemed slightly off. Not forged. Not fake. Just weaker somehow. Shakier than usual. Like a man signing papers while exhausted or medicated. Frank must have noticed my expression because he lowered his voice carefully. Eleanor, if you are uncomfortable with any of this, you may want to consult an attorney before signing anything else. Anything else? Meaning there were still more papers waiting for me at home. By the time I returned home, the winter sun had already started sinking behind the trees lining our neighborhood street. The house looked warm from the outside. Soft yellow lights glowing through the windows. Smoke drifting from the chimney. It looked exactly like the kind of home people imagine when they think about safety and family and holidays. But as I sat in the driveway with my hands resting on the steering wheel, I realized appearances had become meaningless to me now. I no longer trusted what looked comforting. I stepped inside quietly and immediately heard voices coming from the dining room. Daniel and Vanessa stopped talking the second they noticed me. Another small thing. Another silence that arrived too quickly. Vanessa stood near the kitchen island arranging flowers into a vase, while Daniel pretended to scroll through emails on his phone. Neither of them asked where I had been. Long afternoon? Vanessa asked pleasantly. I removed my gloves slowly and hung my coat near the front door. I went to the bank. The room shifted instantly. It was subtle, almost invisible if someone was not paying attention. Daniel's shoulders stiffened slightly. Vanessa's hand paused for half a second above the flowers before continuing again. Oh, she said lightly. Everything all right? I looked directly at her for the first time in days. Her expression remained perfectly composed. Beautiful even. Vanessa had always known how to make warmth look effortless. That was part of what made her dangerous. Frank showed me the trust documents Harold signed before he died, I said calmly. Daniel lowered his phone slowly. Mom, we were going to explain all of that once things settled. Settled down. Another phrase people use when they are buying time. I walked toward the dining room table and placed my purse carefully onto the polished wood surface. Interesting, I said softly, because I do not remember Harold ever discussing majority control being transferred entirely to you. Daniel exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. It was just practical planning. Dad wanted everything streamlined in case something happened. Your father spent 40 years making sure I was protected, I replied quietly. He did not suddenly become careless 3 weeks before his death. Vanessa stepped closer then, her voice gentle in the way nurses sometimes speak to anxious patients. Eleanor, grief can make paperwork feel overwhelming. Nobody is trying to hurt you. I almost admired how smoothly she said it. Calm, caring, reasonable. The perfect performance for anyone watching from the outside. But I had started noticing something else now whenever Vanessa spoke. She never answered the real question directly. She only softened the edges around it. Daniel finally looked at me fully. Mom, you are making this bigger than it is. I studied my son carefully. The little boy who once cried because he accidentally stepped on a bird's nest during a camping trip in Michigan. The teenager who used to leave me notes before football games because he was nervous. Somewhere along the way, that softness had disappeared. Or maybe someone taught him to bury it. Am I asked. The dining room fell quiet again. Snow tapped softly against the windows beside us. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily through the silence. Harold bought that clock during our second year of marriage after working overtime for 3 straight months at the factory. We used to joke that its ticking sounded like the heartbeat of the house. Vanessa folded her arms lightly. Nobody wants conflict, she said. We are family. Family. The word felt almost cruel now. I reached into my sweater pocket and touched the folded note Harold left me years ago. Then I looked at Daniel one last time and saw something I had been avoiding since the funeral. He already believed this house belonged to him. Not eventually. Not someday. Already. And the worst part was not the greed. It was the certainty. Someone had convinced my son that removing me from my own life was simply part of moving forward. That night, I stayed awake long after the house became quiet. Around midnight, I heard Daniel and Vanessa walk upstairs to their bedroom at the far end of the hallway. Their footsteps sounded soft against the carpet, followed by the low murmur of voices behind their closed door. Once, hearing my son home safe for the night used to comfort me. Now it only reminded me how completely the balance inside this house had changed. I sat alone in bed with Harold's note unfolded carefully beside me beneath the glow of the bedside lamp. The words looked different tonight. Not sentimental anymore. Urgent. Promise me you will not let anyone push you aside. I stared at the sentence for a long time before finally reaching for my phone. There was only one person Harold trusted almost as much as family. Rebecca Whitmore, our attorney for nearly 25 years. Rebecca drafted our wills, handled our business contracts, even helped Harold fight a property dispute with a neighbor back in the early 2000s. More importantly, Rebecca never intimidated easily. I left her a voicemail asking if she could meet me privately the next morning. Then I sat quietly listening to the ticking grandfather clock downstairs while snow continued falling outside the windows. The next day, I told Daniel I was meeting an old church friend for coffee. He barely looked up from his laptop when I said it. "Okay, Mom," he replied absently. Mom. Funny how such a small word could suddenly sound so distant. Rebecca's office sat above a bakery in downtown Waukesha. The same office with dark walnut shelves and leather chairs Harold always claimed smelled like expensive pencils. When I walked inside, Rebecca stood immediately and wrapped both arms around me before I could even speak. "Oh, Eleanor," she whispered softly. "I am so sorry about Harold." The kindness in her voice nearly broke something inside me. It had been days since anyone spoke to me without hidden motives buried underneath their words. We sat together in her office while I explained everything slowly. The trust documents, the missing file boxes, Vanessa pushing me toward assisted living before Harold had even been buried properly. Rebecca listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with every detail. Finally, she removed her glasses and leaned back in her chair. "Did Harold ever mention changing the trust structure?" she asked. "Never." "Did he discuss giving Daniel immediate controlling interest over the property?" "Absolutely not." Rebecca nodded once, almost to herself. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "Because according to the last version Harold reviewed with me 6 months ago, the house was placed entirely under survivorship protection for you." I blinked slowly. "Entirely?" "Yes," Rebecca replied calmly. "Meaning ownership should have transferred directly to you upon Harold's death." For several seconds, I could not speak. The office suddenly felt too warm, too small. Then how could the bank documents say otherwise? Rebecca's eyes sharpened slightly. "Because someone amended them afterward." A cold heaviness settled into my chest. Rebecca opened the folder and slid several pages toward me. Harold's original signatures looked strong and familiar there. Confident. Steady. Not like the shaky signatures Frank showed me yesterday. "Eleanor," Rebecca said carefully, "I need you to think very clearly before answering this. During Harold's recovery after surgery, was he taking pain medication?" I nodded slowly. "Quite a bit at first." Rebecca remained silent for a moment. Then she folded her hands together carefully. "People recovering from medical procedures are sometimes pressured into signing documents they do not fully understand." Pressured. The word hung heavily between us. I looked down at Harold's original paperwork and suddenly remembered something strange from October. Vanessa insisting on driving Harold to several appointments herself because Daniel was busy at work. Vanessa organizing his medications every evening. Vanessa answering questions whenever Harold seemed tired. At the time, I thought she was being helpful, loving, even. Rebecca's voice softened again. "I think someone expected grief to keep you from asking questions." I slowly looked up at her then, and for the first time since Harold died, I felt something shift inside me. Not sadness, not confusion, clarity. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt unusually cheerful. Music drifted softly from the kitchen speakers while Vanessa moved around preparing dinner with bright, effortless energy. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air. Daniel sat at the counter scrolling through something on his tablet, smiling faintly at whatever he was reading. For a moment, they looked like a young couple building a comfortable future together. And suddenly I understood why people overlook manipulation so easily. Cruelty rarely arrives wearing anger. Sometimes it arrives smiling while setting the dinner table. "There she is," Vanessa said warmly when I stepped inside. "I was starting to worry about you driving in this weather." I removed my scarf slowly and glanced toward the dining room. 2 folders sat neatly stacked beside Daniel's laptop. Legal folders. My pulse remained calm this time. Rebecca's words had settled something inside me during the drive home. They expected confusion. They expected exhaustion. They expected grief to make me passive. Instead, I felt strangely clear-headed for the first time since Harold died. "Everything all right?" Daniel asked casually. I looked at him carefully before answering. "Actually, yes." That seemed to surprise both of them slightly. Vanessa recovered first, offering me a gentle smile. "Good. Because we were hoping to talk tonight." Of course they were. During dinner, the conversation stayed painfully polite. Vanessa discussed a neighbor renovating their kitchen. Daniel talked about rising property taxes and interest rates. Small, meaningless subjects circling around the real one waiting underneath the table between us. Finally, once the dishes had been cleared away, Daniel opened one of the folders beside him. "Mom," he began carefully, "Vanessa and I have been thinking about the best way to avoid future legal complications." There it was. I folded my napkin slowly into my lap and waited. Vanessa slid a packet of papers across the table toward me. "These are just temporary authorization forms," she explained softly. "Nothing dramatic. They would simply allow Daniel to manage the property accounts while things settle after the estate process." I did not touch the papers. "Interesting," I said quietly. Daniel sighed. "Mom, please do not make this difficult." Difficult. Funny how quickly concern transforms into irritation once control is delayed. I glanced down at the documents anyway. Rebecca had been right. Temporary transfer authorizations. Partial financial access. Property management rights. The language sounded harmless unless someone knew exactly what they were reading. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her expression full of practiced patience. "We are only trying to help you, Eleanor. Managing a large home alone at your age can become overwhelming." At your age? Another carefully placed phrase. Not cruel enough to challenge directly. Just soft enough to make resistance sound unreasonable. I looked up slowly and met her eyes. "You seem very invested in my future living arrangements." The room went quiet. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Vanessa gave a small laugh that did not quite reach her eyes. "I care about this family." Family again. Always family when they wanted something. I closed the folder gently and pushed it back across the table. "I will not be signing anything tonight." Daniel's jaw tightened immediately. "Mom, these are standard forms. Then they can wait." His frustration flickered openly now. "You are acting like we are trying to steal something from you." The sentence hung heavily in the air between us. I noticed Vanessa glance toward him quickly, almost warning him to stay calm. Too late. Because for the first time since this started, someone had finally said the quiet part out loud. I looked at my son for a very long moment. "Are you?" I asked softly. Neither of them answered. Outside, snow continued falling across the backyard while the grandfather clock ticked steadily through the silence. And sitting there beneath the warm dining room lights Harold once loved, I realized something. Heartbreaking. They were no longer afraid of hurting me. They were only afraid of failing. The following morning, I woke to complete silence. No footsteps in the hallway. No low voices from downstairs. Just the soft hum of the furnace pushing warm air through the vents. For a moment, I lay still staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time this house felt peaceful. Then I noticed the digital clock beside the bed. 9:17 a.m. Much later than usual. Harold always woke before sunrise, and after 40 years beside him, my body never truly learned how to sleep late. I wrapped my robe tightly around myself and walked downstairs slowly. The kitchen was empty except for a note taped beside the coffee maker in Vanessa's careful handwriting. "Took Daniel to meet contractors. Back later." Contractors. I stood there staring at the word for several seconds. Not lawyers. Not bankers. Contractors. As if renovations had already become part of their future plans for this house. My house. I poured myself coffee and carried the mug into the den. Snow covered the backyard in untouched white now, making everything outside appear strangely clean and quiet. Harold loved mornings like this. He used to sit in his recliner near the fireplace reading history books while cardinals gathered around the bird feeders outside the window. I lowered myself into the chair across from his and noticed something sticking slightly out from beneath the side table drawer. A yellow legal envelope. My pulse quickened instantly. I reached down carefully and pulled it free. Harold's handwriting stretched across the front in thick black marker. Personal. Private. The envelope felt heavy in my hands. For a moment, I simply stared at it while my coffee cooled beside me untouched. Then I opened it slowly. Inside were copies of legal documents, original trust drafts, property records, handwritten notes, and near the bottom, a folded letter addressed directly to me. Eleanor, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong. My chest tightened painfully as I continued. I did not want to alarm you during my recovery, but there have been increasing disagreements about the estate planning. Daniel has become very influenced by Vanessa regarding financial matters. I tried to believe they were only stressed about their future, but recently I have started questioning their intentions. I covered my mouth with one trembling hand. Harold knew. At least part of him knew. The letter continued in the same steady handwriting I had loved for decades. Last month, Vanessa pushed aggressively for changes to the trust while I was still taking medication after surgery. She insisted the house should eventually belong entirely to Daniel because older people should simplify things before it becomes a burden. Something about the conversation disturbed me deeply. I warned Rebecca to keep copies of all original documents protected separately. If anyone pressures you after I am gone, promise me you will slow down and ask questions first. You have every legal right to remain in this home for the rest of your life. Every legal right. Tears blurred my vision suddenly, but they were not only grief anymore. There was relief hidden inside them too. Relief that Harold had not abandoned me willingly. Relief that somewhere beneath all the manipulation and quiet pressure, he had still been trying to protect me. I folded the letter carefully against my chest just as headlights swept across the front windows outside. Vanessa's SUV pulled into the driveway. A few seconds later, I heard the garage door opening. Their voices drifted faintly inside from the cold. Laughing, relaxed, confident. They still believed I was grieving too deeply to fight back. I slipped Harold's letter back into the envelope and stood slowly from the chair. Then I walked toward the front hallway just as the kitchen door opened and Daniel stepped inside, carrying paint samples in one hand. Paint samples. Vanessa smiled brightly when she saw me standing there. Good morning, Eleanor, she said warmly. We have some exciting ideas to discuss with you. I looked at both of them calmly while Harold's letter rested hidden beneath my arm. Then for the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled back. Vanessa spread the paint samples across the kitchen island like someone planning a celebration instead of dismantling another. Person's life. Soft beige, pale gray, cream linen white. Daniel stood beside her sipping coffee while she described nursery themes and wall finishes with calm excitement. This one feels airy and modern, she said, holding up a pale blue sample toward the dining room light. And if we remove the old bookshelves upstairs, the room will feel twice as large. Upstairs, the master bedroom, my bedroom, Harold's bookshelves. I stood quietly near the sink listening while snow melted slowly from their boots onto the kitchen floor. Neither of them noticed I no longer looked shocked by any of it. That was the interesting thing about betrayal. Once the wound fully opened, fear slowly disappeared. In its place came something colder and far more dangerous. Understanding. What do you think, Eleanor? Vanessa asked sweetly. I folded my hands together lightly. I think people should be careful about redesigning rooms they do not legally own yet. Silence dropped instantly across the kitchen. Daniel lowered his coffee cup slowly onto the counter. Vanessa blinked once, her polished smile faltering for the first time since Harold died. I am not sure what you mean, she replied carefully. I think you do. My voice remained calm, steady, almost gentle. I walked toward the dining room table and placed Harold's yellow envelope softly onto the wood between us. Daniel's eyes fixed on it immediately. Vanessa stayed perfectly still. I met with Rebecca yesterday, I continued, and this morning I found something Harold left hidden in the den. Neither of them spoke. The house felt incredibly quiet around us now except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock near the staircase. Tick, 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 like the sound of time finally running out. I slowly removed Harold's handwritten letter from the envelope and unfolded it carefully. He was worried about changes being made while he was recovering after surgery, I said softly, especially changes involving the trust. Daniel's face lost color almost instantly. Vanessa stepped forward quickly, her voice still smooth but tighter now. Eleanor, I think grief may be causing misunderstandings. No, I interrupted quietly. I think grief stopped me from seeing clearly until now. Daniel finally spoke then, too fast and too defensive. Mom, Dad wanted me involved because someone has to manage things eventually. Manage things, I repeated, or inherit them faster? His mouth opened slightly, but no answer came. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly, shifting strategies immediately. Harold signed those documents willingly. I looked directly at her. While medicated after heart surgery, for the first time, genuine panic flickered across her face before disappearing again beneath composure. Small, quick, but enough. Daniel looked back and forth between us now, suddenly uncertain. And in that moment, I finally saw the truth clearly. Vanessa had been steering this entire situation for months, maybe longer. But Daniel allowed it because somewhere along the way, convenience became more important than loyalty. I carefully folded Harold's letter again and slid it back into the envelope. Rebecca is filing an immediate review of every amended document connected to the trust, I said calmly. Until then, no property transfers, renovations, or financial authorizations will move forward. Vanessa stared at me silently. The warmth in her expression had vanished completely now. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face, exhausted and frustrated. Mom, this is turning into something ugly. I looked at my son for a very long moment. Then I glanced around the kitchen, Harold, and I built together piece by piece over 40 years. The hardwood floors we saved 3 summers to afford. The cabinets Harold installed himself during one brutally hot July while refusing to hire contractors because he wanted every inch of this house done with care. Family homes do not become sacred because of money. They become sacred because someone gave their entire life to building them. I met Daniel's eyes again and spoke softly. No, sweetheart. It was already ugly. I just finally stopped pretending it was not.